So I find it damn funny that people who are very upset about Trump, their responses, their solutions are also very Trumpist. We should minimize imports. We try to export more. You sound like Trump. I want China to succeed. I want China to be the largest economy in the world. Right? That would be good to reduce global inequality. But just because something is desirable doesn't make it more probable, and certainly doesn't make it inevitable. We can easily fund all these things, lor.
By reducing the surpluses?
Yeah.
But what about the rainy day or not?
We can talk about rainy day when the government tells us how much they have already squared away for the rainy day. Your obsession about Singapore says more about yourselves, what you are doing wrong in Hong Kong. Because Singapore is not out to eat Hong Kong's lunch as a financial centre, right? That you are even worried about losing that status to Singapore says more about your own dysfunction. Now you see why I'm not very popular in Hong Kong.
Yeah, the writ of election has been issued, and boy, oh boy, do we have something cooking. Now, some of you may have started listening to us during the last election back in 2020, when we did a daily podcast during the entire campaign period. We're going to be doing the same thing this year as well, with a daily podcast coming out each day that will cover everything you need to know about GE 2025. But we're going to be doing something even more epic this time around. We are going to be going to every GRC and SMC, all 33 of them, during the campaign period. We'll be recording podcasts and capturing the energy on the ground in person. It's going to be super exciting, and we'd love for you to follow our journey and even come meet us face to face. We'll be sharing more details of where we'll be every day, and to find out firsthand, head to yalabat.com and subscribe to our newsletter. It's going to be awesome. And now, on to the podcast. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Yala, your thrice weekly podcast where we talk about the hottest news with a touch of what, Terrence?
Good old humor.
Good old humor, man.
Yeah.
With all this talk of of course there's elections.
Yes.
There's stuff concerning Singapore, but there's also stuff concerning the world when it comes to the macroeconomic shifts.
And where Singapore sits in the world today. There's a lot of discussion about that.
Yeah, and of course China, the role of China.
Yeah.
So with us, we have someone who we've been in touch with for quite a while, but we finally have made this happen. He's finally on our podcast, and we'd like to introduce Donald Loh, who is a professor of practice at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and also author of his latest book, The Price of Zero, which is China's policy missteps during and after COVID.
Yes.
So, welcome to Yalabat, Donald.
Thank you, Haresh.
Yeah.
Thank you, Terrence. I follow your podcast.
Yeah.
It's very well produced. It's a real privilege for me to be here.
Wow,
Thank you very
that's
much.
a great way to start a podcast, man.
But
Suck up to your host.
we know that you're in Hong Kong, but what are you back in Singapore for? Is it like the elections got you so excited? You have to be back here.
No, I still have to make a living. This is middle of semester in Hong Kong, but I have some work in Singapore. I'm doing some teaching for a group from Saudi Arabia that happens that's visiting Singapore. So very lucky to be back here at the time when election fever is just heating up,
bubbling,
simmering.
Do you feel it as you talking to people?
Everybody talks about it.
Okay,
I think Bertha was on your show and she says how compared to 2020, this time around it feels a lot more real, right? A lot more salient.
So it's not like an awkward thing to come up during your coffee catch-ups and all. It's like
everybody
central.
talks about. It's never awkward, right? Even in previous years. But this year I think because of the salience of so many vexatious issues, right? The tariffs, China's slowdown, our own domestic politics, a new prime minister, first elections. Yeah. So everybody is more, rightly or wrongly, more excited. I think it's a good thing. It's a good thing for citizens to be engaged, to be excited about elections.
And you're still very clued in what's happening.
Try to be. Nothing beats being here. I spend most of my time in Hong Kong, China. Right? But so much of what I receive is secondhand. So I value every opportunity to be back in Singapore, talking to Singaporeans,
doing your walkabouts.
I'll be completely unrecognizable.
He's here to announce his candidacy.
and I might get eggs thrown at me. So try to
So for context, your area of expertise is economy. You're an economist by training.
That's right.
Right to say? Yeah. And your background, you've been in academia for how long already?
Since 2012, so about 13 years already.
And prior to that?
Private, mostly government, about 14 years in government.
So you were part of the system.
Yeah. I was colleagues for a few years with Prime Minister Lawrence Wong.
I see.
see.
First-hand experience right here, lah. Right.
In the early
Yeah,
years
in the
of their
early
career.
2000s.
So
yeah.
you all
I
were kind of
see.
similar kind of cohort or similar kind
Yes,
of
yes, we were peers. Yeah.
Yes. And economics in
Yes, he was also. I mean, he's a much more qualified economist. I went to Oxford to do PPE, which is also Kelvin Cheng's.
Okay. Wow,
So
esteemed.
I'm K1. My economics is 6:30. I mean, he's a serious technical economist. He can build his own models. He understands economic journal papers even today. I'm sure.
So you're talking about Lawrence Wong? Or,
Lawrence Wong.
Oh, I thought you meant Kelvin Cheng. I was like, okay, where was that? But how does it? Yeah, how does it feel like being in Hong Kong and seeing all this happening in Singapore? How do you feel when you're apart
that's a
from
great
it?
question, right? When I went to Hong Kong, I don't think I had high expectations, right? But first the protests.
and this was 2019 you went to
That's
Hong
right.
Kong,
I went in January 2019. Then we had the protests, and I saw how badly the Hong Kong government managed or responded to the protests. Then they had COVID, right? And I think they overreacted. They treated it like SARS.
Yeah.
And they treated it like SARS for 3 years into COVID. They had this very draconian zero COVID policy. I mean, not as draconian as the mainland, of course, but by the standards of a global city, it was nuts for them to even contemplate lockdowns, compulsory testing, 3-week quarantines. When during COVID, I came back to Singapore a couple of times. When I went back to Hong Kong, I had to do 3-week quarantines, right? At least for one of those. And then the second one was 1 week. But still, it was nuts. And the rest of the world had already opened up. Singapore was benefiting from Hong Kong's zero COVID policy. And remember in 2022, we had a flood of Hong Kong bankers, professionals, executives who just came to Singapore to run away from the madness, what I call zero COVID madness. So I think being in Hong Kong kind of made me realize that, hey, this Singapore government, for all our criticisms, is actually fairly pragmatic, right? It's very pragmatic and makes policy on evidence-based, scientific, treats public policy seriously and treats it like a science almost, right? So you got to appreciate what we have in Singapore. That became very apparent during COVID. And it was not just Hong Kong. I mean, Hong Kong only pursued such, unviable, economically damaging, self-destructive COVID policy because it had to adhere to the mainland's zero COVID stance.
But that's interesting because in Singapore, I think I remember thinking like, oh, everyone else is opening up. Because I mean, we opened up, closed back, opened up, closed back.
Yeah.
So, but what you're saying is in Hong Kong, it was even more extreme.
Yeah, they didn't even have that debate.
No, it was
right?
just
the slogan then was perseverance is victory, right? 坚持就是胜利. Just perseverance with what? With suppression.
Yeah.
And so the book that you mentioned is really a compilation. At least the first 40% of it is a compilation of commentaries I'd written from as early as February 2020, where I said this suppression thing is not going to work, right? Or at least there is a good chance that we will not eliminate this coronavirus, right? It's going to become endemic. And we better learn to live with it, right? Better learn to deal with it, adapt to it like we do with the flu. So and then in 2021, virtually every other month I was putting out these commentaries. When I put it out in 2021, it was increasingly conventional wisdom in Singapore and the rest of the world that COVID is not going to go and it's going to be with us for the rest of our lives. But in China, it was almost heretical, right? And I got a lot of hate mail and criticism, not from colleagues. And colleagues were incredibly supportive, but from whoever the nationalists, whatever. So how dare you propose something
so you
other
got
than
hate comments, or you got hate comments?
Yeah, the level of political polarization. And the level of hate speech in politics in Hong Kong is higher than in Singapore.
But in 2020, that's quite early into COVID. But what gave you the conviction that we have to learn to deal with it endemically? Because you're not an infectious diseases expert.
Yeah, that's what Paul Tambaya said. Right? One of the jobs I did in the Singapore government was scenario planning. And what the scenario planning methodology teaches you is to think not in terms of linear straight line predictions, but to think in terms of very distinct, very different, but plausible scenarios.
Okay.
So, and in the field of infectious diseases, we did do some scenarios, at least some preliminary scenario thinking about. And then essentially we knew that there's a kind of infectious disease like SARS, which is quite deadly but not very transmissible. Then there's another thing which is much closer to flu, not so deadly but increasingly transmissible because the virus becomes highly adapted to human society. At the early stage, we were treating it like SARS, but you could tell that, the Prime Minister, then Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said in his first televised address to the population that there is a chance that this might become more like the fatality rate doesn't make it like SARS. It is only slightly higher than the flu. So even in the early days, even before COVID was called COVID, right? Initially we didn't have it was just called the novel coronavirus. There was a strand of thinking that we might not get so lucky this time as we did with SARS. I mean, SARS just went away after 3 or 4 months.
I see. So, but just going back to the idea of COVID, right? It was over a whole period of like 3 to 5 years, depending on...
2 years for Singapore only.
2 years for Singapore, it felt like... it took a while. It felt very long, right? So,
Yeah,
I
like
was
a
going
lifetime.
through the essays and it really, brought me back to those days, even from the early days when, oh my God, we're like, what are we dealing with? And then slowly as it progressed, it made you think about how your country is dealing with it versus other countries, all right? So, for you, like when you were writing all these essays, do you mean to, like, it was meant to be almost like a journal kind of thing, or were you trying to rally people to look at the policy more critically, or what?
Wow, that's a great question. Obviously, it wasn't a journal. I don't write journals. These are all newspaper commentaries where either somebody asked me or I offered it to the newspapers. But then looking back, you could see that I thought that there was a certain coherence to it, that there's no reason to fear that we cannot survive this pandemic. This is not the worst thing to happen, right? You can imagine far worse things, right? It could be like SARS, but combined with the transmissibility of the flu, right? So this is not all doom and gloom, and that we could learn to live with it. And then very luckily we got vaccine within a year. I mean, can you think of other pandemics where we got a vaccine within such a short space of time? So in Hong Kong, because they were pursuing their version of zero COVID for so long, that actually made things worse in terms of at least two things. First, it discouraged vaccination, right, especially among older people, because they thought, well, since there are no cases, what's the rush? We are not at risk. If I get vaccinated, I might get side effects. So they weigh the risk and say, better off not getting. So it created a lot of complacency among the population. Second, you don't have a population that is sufficiently vaccinated. On top of that, you have very few outbreaks, very few major outbreaks. So you don't get herd immunity, right? Immunity from prior infection. So what I was trying to do in those dark days of 2021 was to tell that you're going to pay a big price. Right? Hence the title, The Price of Zero. You're going to pay a big price for pursuing this suppression policy for too long and too harsh. And true enough, when Hong Kong did have a big outbreak with the Omicron variant in early 2022, in those 4 months, Hong Kong had the world's highest COVID mortality rate. 1 in 1,000 people. That's a very high mortality. 1 in 1,000 people in Hong Kong died of COVID in those 4 to 5 months. And then throughout the pandemic, Hong Kong has had more excess deaths per, say, 10,000 people than obviously Singapore, South Korea, even Japan, which is a much older population. And even Malaysia, which is less developed, right? Much poorer than Hong Kong. So, I really, as I always tell my Hong Kong friends, there is no meaningful metric that we can use to say that Hong Kong did an okay job or a good job. Right? And economically, they paid a big price, but we know that, right? Because if you have such harsh suppression policy, that kills the economy. And so in Singapore in 2022, when our GDP rebounded, I can't remember what it was, 4%, 5%, or more than that. Hong Kong's economy shrank by 3.5% in 2022. So the gap in performance is huge, not just in terms of protecting lives, but in terms of protecting the economy.
But in terms of the perception that that you were how dare you say these things in Hong Kong? Like, did it come across like, oh, this guy from Singapore, look at him, being so yaya papaya and all
Indeed.
Maybe even being an agent of Singapore, trying to sow more chaos and all that.
Nobody accuses us of being of that, right? Or trying to influence but they do think of this smug Singaporean who's always comparing Hong Kong with Singapore, and then of course Hong Kong always comes out poorly in these comparisons. But one thing you have to say about the Hong Kong people, they're incredibly resilient and they can take it one, right? Whether it's their politicians or their civil servants, they've got much thicker skins than
our
elites are. So yeah, they will mumble and gripe, and sometimes there will be pushback from the nationalists, right?
Yeah.
But bottom line is, this is still a more, how should I put it? Tolerant is, maybe tolerant, more kind of accommodating, they can roll with the punches. They're more politically open. They may not be able to do anything about it. They may even say, I acknowledge and I agree even with your criticism, but I can't do anything about it. But they don't question your right to speak up.
I see.
But I mean, like, from my understanding, that there's the Hong Kong chief executive, right? But when you were saying that the politicians, they might agree or disagree, that's still within Hong Kong. But what about the mothership of the motherland?
The motherland,
Was there any fear?
I don't dare to say anything.
But I mean, you do comment a lot. I mean, this book is essentially
the second half of the book is about the
China, right? And the price of, like what you said, the COVID zero policy, which is very critical about some of the policies that were taken, some of the actions of the government, the complete reversal. So there's no fear there. It's like in Singapore, we get asked, you bring opposition, how? Scared or not? Now we're like, hey, you talk about China, you scared or not?
Yeah, scared lah. Must calculate lah. But because I'm publishing through these established newspapers, so there is, I guess, if it passes muster with the South China Morning Post, then they made it's somewhat tolerable, right? And also I write in English, right? I don't have a following that in Hong Kong that reads primarily in English. If I were to write in Chinese and I were constantly criticizing the government, the authorities, the risk of getting into trouble are much higher. And third, I'm Singaporean, right? So they can easily dismiss, this is some ignorant foreigner. Right? So they don't have this, foreigners cannot interfere in our own affairs thing. I mean, certainly Hong Kong doesn't. The mainland probably does, but mainland, my readership is not the mainland. And certainly not the mainland's policy-making elites.
Got it. Does that mean, like, when Paul Tambaya came on, he said, like, one thing that really shocked him about what Singapore did was the COVID white paper that was released after.
Yeah.
Was that something? Right? Was that a big reference point for you when also thinking about
coming out of COVID, Singapore by that time was clearly well past, peak COVID, right? And Hong Kong has just come out, and then we did that white paper around then.
Yeah.
So I wrote a piece saying, right, which is also in the book, saying, hey, Singapore doesn't really need to do that white paper because Singapore's performance in overall during COVID was quite stellar. But even so, we had the honesty and the self-critical mindset, right, to engage in a fairly robust white paper exercise. And Hong Kong needs that white paper, needs COI even. Right? And actually, in Hong Kong's recent past, they did, after SARS, they had not one, not two, but three commissions of inquiry right, established by different parts of the Hong Kong establishment. But on COVID mismanagement, silence. So I said, you're not, if you don't have an honest or self-critical assessment, evaluation of how are you ever going to learn from your mistakes? And so the introduction chapter is China's zero COVID, chronic zero COVID trauma, and the idea of why do somebody suffer from chronic trauma? Because they haven't addressed, they haven't processed that, they haven't come to grip with that, why they ended up that way. So if you don't come to grip, you don't come to this reckoning, right? Then that trauma keeps recurring. And this is what we are seeing in the Chinese economy, right? Confidence is, even today, consumer confidence is almost as low as it was in the middle of 2022, right? During the darkest day. This was during the Shanghai lockdown, right? China's most prosperous, most liberal, most cosmopolitan city being locked down for 3 months, right? And they haven't really come to terms with that yet. There's no, and then when finally they abandoned zero COVID in the mainland, in early end 2022, end 2022, early 2023. There were lots of deaths, I guess, COVID deaths, lots of cases. It was just became widespread, right? And Chinese people asking, what were all the sacrifices for, right, in the last 2 years? What was all this perseverance with zero COVID is victory for, right? So, the government kind of knew that. So in March, I think it was March in 2023, the government said our handling of COVID throughout the pandemic was completely correct. 完全正确. Even the Singapore government wouldn't dare to boast that our handling of COVID was completely correct, right? And we did much better. So you can see the kind of brazen self-praise, right? The brazen unwillingness to engage with any form of criticism. So I guess all these few years in Hong Kong and China made me kind of realize that, hey, this Singapore government, when it wants to, it can get its act together.
Yeah. But so how was it watching your ex-colleague, right? Sort of his star rising through that whole COVID period as well.
Oh, I was very happy for him.
Okay.
I mean, I'm a big fan of Lawrence, right? I mean, of the 4G, I don't think anybody is better qualified, better in every respect, right? Not just academically. I mean, he's a nerd, there's no doubt about that.
Hey, he play guitar, no, bro.
With a band.
That makes me more nerdy than him. Right? But so I was very happy. In fact, during COVID, I would from time to time post that, why doesn't Hong Kong have somebody like that?
Oh, really?
Look at his crisis comms, right? Look at the way he's, handles how calm he is under pressure. So I really was very pleased when he was
But
elevated.
do you expect it, given that you knew him from so long ago?
I wouldn't say I expected it fully, but when he was first, nobody expected that COVID would be this prolonged 2-year plus pandemic, right? So, but when he was appointed into this, I kind of knew that we are in good hands.
But I mean, when back from the time that you were colleagues with him.
He was great. He was damn good. As a civil servant, he was top notch one.
Top notch in what way? Like
the analysis is better than other AOs, right? Because he's an economist, right? A very qualified economist. That shows my own bias as an economist. And he had a way of influencing, persuading. He never comes across as threatening or overbearing, or he's just a very good colleague to work with, and a very good boss to work for if you work for him.
So seeing his star sort of rise through the ranks of the 4G, did that also make you feel like politics in Singapore might be moving in a different direction away from the...
Up to a point, because it's not just the 4G that's taking over, right? I mean, we still have... I mean, like I say in my previous book, PAP versus PAP, there are two faces to the party, right?
Yeah.
There is this reformist, pragmatic, evidence-based, even somewhat liberalizing face, right? Then there is a conservative, repressive, right? The
old school,
the knuckle duster approach face, and that part of the PAP is still there, right? It's still very, very salient. It's nowhere near. This has not been this transition to the 4G is not complete yet. And we'll see after the elections whether it's complete.
But do you see progress? Because I know there was the interview you did with Anthony Bourdain where you were saying that you feel that Singapore is a bit too fearful of opening up the press and opening up certain
political competition.
Political competition, and that was in 2017, right? So that's 8 years ago. Do you see us moving towards that direction? I mean, given that there is still the balance of the old guard and the new guard, but how do you see the evolution?
If it's moving in the direction, it's not because of the graces or the generosity of the PAP. It's because Singaporeans themselves claim the space. Right, we've got more civil society activists. Whatever you say, whether you support the death penalty or not, you have to give credit to the anti-death penalty activists. Right, they have shifted the Overton window, right, in terms of that this sort of activism is acceptable. And the more government tries to slap them or punish them or repress them or persecute them, the more the population says, right, this is the kind of society we're becoming, where we are democratizing, even though we are, you might say that we are not yet fully there yet. But Singapore society is opening up, is democratizing. And I guess the PAP being, if you want to be in power, you just have to accept this you just have to adapt to this new reality. There are things that the PAP would have done 20 years ago, certainly in Lee Kuan Yew's time, that is unthinkable for them to do now, right? In terms of political repression.
Yeah.
So then do you see it like worlds apart from your time in Hong Kong? Because I know in the book you also mentioned that when you started seeing the COVID zero policy, you were kind of curious why there weren't that many people speaking out against it, right? Is there a much stronger culture of fear of speaking out there compared to Singapore? Because I mean, Singapore, that's what we grow up with, right? You can't say anything, but I mean, we wouldn't be able to do this podcast if it was really controlled, right?
Yeah.
So I think that is evolving. But in Hong Kong, was it like just another level that as Singaporeans we cannot appreciate?
I think post-protest, before the protest, it was even more open than Singapore, right? Hong Kong may not be a democracy. They may not get to, universal suffrage to vote for their chief executive. Nonetheless, the political culture is very open and vibrant. Civil society there is way more developed than Singapore's. I mean, the protest is entirely self-organized, right? You can mobilize more than 1 million people on the streets.
No need to apply for permit.
No need to. Well, you still have to apply for a permit, and the police would give it, right? So the protests, at least the peaceful parts of the protest, are highly coordinated between the protest organizers and the police. So they have this liberal culture, even though it's not a fully politically liberal system. Then after the protest, I think there was, chilling, right? A lot of people fled. Subsequently, there was the national security law in the middle of 2020, right? Or 2020, I can't remember. That kind of made it easier for the authorities to say, this is subversion, right? This is sedition, and we can prosecute you for that. And indeed, they have prosecuted. I mean, the opposition in Hong Kong has essentially been decimated.
Yeah.
All the LegCo members are essentially from different parties that are pro-Beijing. Right? Until recently, Hong Kong had a very vibrant, non-pro-Beijing opposition. And that's completely disappeared. So I think in that climate, post-protest, there was a lot less disagreement or dissent with zero COVID. Right? Because the oppositionists have been silenced. Those who you would expect to speak out against this policy had all been either silenced, driven out, marginalized, whatever. Right? No platform.
I mean, one interesting thing, and I think because of your position, you are very well placed to talk about it. But because we cover the news a lot, and I realized that in Hong Kong, there's almost this there's always a lot of comparisons to Singapore, right? There's sometimes in Singapore we don't even think about this comparison. Correct. So, for example, when Leo Messi, the whole thing in Hong Kong. And then the talk was about, we got to trump Singapore as a hub and things like that.
And
I think
Taylor
Swift and Coldplay, I think recently was in Hong Kong. I saw articles saying that, you see what we did in Hong Kong is so much better than Singapore, something like that, paraphrasing. So why is there that, especially after COVID, there's such a strong sense of like, we got to beat Singapore at it. Whereas in Singapore, I feel like, we talk about, how the US is affecting us, how we are in ASEAN, but we don't think so much in that direction. Why is that so?
Because previously they looked down on us. When I was in government in the 2000s, we would always benchmark ourselves against Hong Kong. Right? At that time, up to about 2003, 2004, our GDP per capita were very similar. Right? And we, in some respects, we always looked up to Hong Kong. Right? Lee Kuan Yew himself said, I wish we were more vibrant, more entrepreneurial. And he would reference Hong Kong. So, so in those days, it's the opposite of now. Right? In those days, it was us that was always comparing ourselves against Hong Kong. Then after 2004, our relative performance just diverged. Right? We were still growing about 5% a year. Their growth slowed. I mean, their growth was down to about 2% a year. So today, Singapore's GDP per capita is about 70% higher than Hong Kong's. Right? Then during COVID, especially during their zero COVID madness in early 2022, when all the Hong Kong professionals, bankers, right, senior executives fled to Singapore, then Hong Kong started saying, what the hell, right? Singapore's going to eat our lunch, right? We're going to lose our status as an international financial center. So I kept getting asked, right? Because as the one of the
President,
few
Singapore expert.
one of the few Singapore experts in Hong Kong. Like, what's Singapore doing? Is Singapore going to overtake? And I say, Singapore's not even that interested in replacing you as a financial hub, right? We are much more a manufacturing and high-tech hub, right? We are much more, diversified as an economy. So they feel very insecure, partly because we've done so much better in the last 20 years. And secondly, because we are even on that thing that they had over us, right? The financial center of Asia. We seem to be
inching
ahead or competing with them. And then I said, your obsession about Singapore says more about yourselves, what you are doing wrong in Hong Kong, than what Singapore is doing right. Because Singapore is not out to eat Hong Kong's lunch as a financial center. Right? That you are even worried about losing that status to Singapore says more about your own dysfunctions. Now you see why I'm not very popular in Hong Kong.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. After that, they probably stop coming to you for advice. You're like that friend. You're like, hey, Donald, help me. You're like, you're just insecure.
Exactly.
Look in the mirror. That's the problem.
Look at me.
It's not us, it's you.
So then being in Hong Kong, and I mean, you grew up in Singapore, spent most of your life in Singapore, right? Being in Hong Kong, and like, how has it changed your perception of Singapore? Be it come to the people, because you just said that the Hong Kong people, there's a lot of resilience, a lot of grit, right?
Yeah.
But when you look at Singapore from abroad, be it the people, the culture, the government, any new thoughts or epiphanies?
Before I went to Hong Kong, I thought, what's wrong with Singaporeans wanting more government help, right? Government support, government redistribution. In fact, I would call for that.
Do you mean CDC vouchers and all that?
Yeah, to some extent. And then I go to Hong Kong and see nobody asked for that one. Right? So I don't know which is better lah. I mean, I think Singapore government can do a lot more because so much fiscal resources. There's a lot more scope of redistribution. I think our fears of welfareism, people becoming lazy, those are exaggerated lah. But then you look at the Hong Kongers and they don't look to government to solve their problems one.
Is it a lack of trust, or is it just...
Yeah, partly they think the government will screw it up if government try. But like every year the budget, Singapore's and Hong Kong's budget more or less the same time. So because I used to do the budget, I would compare, right? Then in Hong Kong, in Singapore, every year we ask, what's in it for me, right? What are the giveaways? What are the good? Is this an election budget, blah, 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 right? And how much am I getting? In Hong Kong,
So that builds resilience in the people? Or?
The people just generally said, don't look to government for anything, right? Don't look. So which is why zero COVID is so shocking to me. The Hong Kongers didn't ask for this. They certainly didn't expect government to, right, protect them from something like the flu, right? Okay, to be fair, it eventually became like the flu with vaccination and all. But look at, they have something like our CPF, right? They call it the MPF. Our CPF is guaranteed to at least 2.5%. Theirs, nothing is guaranteed. You make your own investment decisions. You put in the wrong funds, as I have done. I'm a useless economist. I've lost money. I've actually the value of my MPF savings now are less than my contribution, the principal.
I see.
Right? And I'm sure that is the case for most Hong Kongers. Right? If even a trained economist cannot make money on his investments, what are the chances that the average citizen can? And no, I have never heard a single Hong Konger say that this is unacceptable. The government should underwrite, right? Should ensure that I earn a certain return, or should at least protect the principal of my MPF contributions. Nobody ever says that. So it's a very different social contract. Right? Here are the social contracts, right? I vote for you, you better give me the protection, housing, right? Good education, job security, financial security, which I think is good, right? To a point, right? To a point, it's good. Now Hong Kong is the other extreme, right? Nobody looks to government to give them any sort of social protection.
I think I bookmarked my CDC voucher thing already, because it's every time, why key in a new link? Just bookmark.
30 May.
That's a good point.
But then does that mean that Singaporeans are sort of in this bubble where we don't see how because we've lived overseas and all, and the rest of the world is like the government,
like Hong Kong, right?
The government presence in your life is very little except for collecting taxes.
Yeah, that's the irony, right? The Singapore government spending is not that high by international standards. It's just slightly over 20%. In the European countries, it's usually well over 40%. So the actual government spending is not that high, but the government looms very large in our minds, right?
Yeah.
Right? What is the government doing for me? Or whether you're PAP or opposition politician, almost all the debate is about what we want the government to do more of.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I do think there's certain things we want government to do more. Right. Unemployment insurance or protection. Right. More redistribution, more affordable housing. Peace of mind on healthcare spending.
Yeah.
I think these are things, no doubt, right, that the Singapore government should do more. But we really need to get away from looking to government on many other things, resolving our disputes, right? You don't like something Calvin Cheng said, we look to the police, we look to the
Police
government.
report.
Right?
Police report.
I think we really shouldn't.
So is that like in Hong Kong, do you see the general behavior of people also kind of reflective of, being more independent?
Yeah,
do you see the
definitely.
converse in Singapore, even in social settings?
Yes.
How?
They just don't talk. Government just doesn't loom that much in people's minds.
There's more agency.
There's more agency, and then every time we suggest government should do more, they are very skeptical, right? They'll say the government will screw it up, they'll make things worse, right? So their problem is too little trust.
Yeah.
Right. Ours is too much. We entrust the government with too many things.
Yeah.
Right? Too high expectations.
But I mean, at the same time, looking at COVID, how you said that, you were impressed at how Singapore kind of handled it.
Yeah.
And generally, when you look at other countries these days, I mean, Singapore, by all accounts, is doing pretty decent. So
it's okay.
Is it wrong for there, or is it less?
It's not wrong. It's not wrong. Yeah.
Or less constructive for the individual, for society to have trust in a government that actually is doing things.
Oh no,
generally okay.
Singaporeans to have trust in government is fantastic.
Yeah.
Right. If governments don't have trust, they're paralyzed.
Yeah.
Right. You can't enforce many things. If people don't trust you that you will spend public monies wisely, they will be much more reluctant to pay their taxes. I mean, on that actually, Hong Kong does a good job. Tax compliance is also very high. So it is on these issues where on social mores, on how much protection should government give people on their retirement savings, should government do more public housing. There, Hong Kongers don't look to or don't trust the government to solve those problems. Maybe it's because they've been conditioned, right, by years of government neglect or incompetence. But in Singapore, I think we assume that there's a natural instinct that if the government gets involved, you'll make things better. But why should we assume so? But let's say on dealing with social media conflicts, if government's getting in, might actually make things worse.
Yeah.
Right. In some respects, by signaling where it stands, it might improve things. But I wish we were better able to resolve these citizen-to-citizen conflicts, right, without resorting to government intervention or police investigations.
So, I mean, just talking about that, the social aspect of things, like the infrastructure and comparing with Hong Kong, of course, there's a lot of figures and everything. But that you mentioned that there are a lot of MNCs and all which are also packing up and moving over from Hong Kong to Singapore. Is there do you see that trend picking up pace in recent years, or is it just a myth that created to make everyone very kanchong about it?
During COVID, certainly there was that trend.
Okay.
Then after China and of course Hong Kong dropped all the COVID restrictions, there was a bit of reversal.
Yeah.
But I think that in net terms, Singapore has gained and Hong Kong has lost. Right. So very soon after COVID, I think Singapore also first introduced talent. Right, I can't remember, some talent visa. Right? And then Hong Kong felt under enormous pressure to do something similar. Otherwise, there will be even more brain drain to Singapore. So they launched one, very liberal, right? As long as you graduated from a top 100 university by whichever ranking, even you don't have a job, you can get this one of these 2 talent visas to Hong Kong. So in the first year, I think they had, for one of these or both of these schemes, they had 90,000 successful applicants. But about 90% of these, right, more than 80,000 of these were from mainland China. Right? And many of these didn't actually show up in Hong Kong. They just wanted this as a backstop. So that's the thing. I mean, the fact of the matter is Hong Kong's economic future and every future is tied to the mainland, is tethered to the mainland now. So when the mainland slows, right, as it is economically, you can see the effects in Hong Kong very dramatically, very obviously.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas Singapore has got more economic independence, right? And we have got a far more diversified economy sectorally in terms of sources of demand. So that puts Singapore in a stronger position economically, as well as, I guess, geopolitically.
How about lifestyle-wise though? Like, I think before this we were talking about nightlife in Singapore is so dead compared to somewhere like Hong Kong, right? Like, is Singapore actually a desirable place for expats to live, you think, vis-a-vis Hong Kong?
But government say cannot party late at night, so must go sleep.
Yeah, it depends on which part of town you're at.
Nightlife is pretty dead in Singapore now, right? That's what I heard.
Tough,
Also, Singapore attracts a different kind of expatriates, right? Mostly older families, so that are not so much into that. Hong Kong's expatriate community tends to be younger. Yeah, it's smaller than before COVID, but it is younger, and so there's more demand for. And also, alcohol taxes in Hong Kong are much lower than they are in Singapore. I mean, wine is not taxed, sake is not taxed.
Oh,
right. So just on those basic factors, it's just more affordable to have a night out in the city, right? Whereas in Singapore, it's very expensive.
It's punishing.
It's punishing. If you drink, if you don't drink, it's okay. Barely okay. But if you drink, that's it really.
So I mean, that's one thing that being abroad, I think now you have a different lens looking at Singapore, right? But I gather from the essays that a lot of your essays and all are also based in behavioral economics, right? So is there anything about Singapore that you think us Singaporeans are not aware of, especially when you read international media? And as a proxy, like when you're talking about China, and a lot of what you're saying about China is that its economy is declining, and it's not...
It's declining only in relative terms. In absolute terms, it's still growing, of course.
But it's not, like I think years ago, it was China was going to take over the world.
That's clearly not going to happen.
Yeah, and you have pointed out that it's kind of counter to what you see a lot of China bulls talk about. Like the born again Chinese in Singapore. Or even when we had Kishore Mehbubani on our podcast, he said he was so bullish about China. But then when I read your essays, I'm like, oh, actually, it's not all shiny stuff there. So, I mean, maybe you can share a bit more about that, but also bringing it back to Singapore. Is there anything that you see about Singapore from an outsider's perspective that's counterintuitive?
Well, you know what Singaporeans might consider counterintuitive, say about China, right? My claim that China may never overtake the US as may never be the largest economy in the world. That's counterintuitive to Singaporeans. But to my Chinese students, that's conventional wisdom.
Really?
Yeah. So they are not, the people most pessimistic about China's prospects are the Chinese people themselves. Because they experience it on a daily basis. Kishore doesn't, he's my former boss, I wouldn't badmouth him. But he doesn't read Chinese. Yes, never spent significant period of time living in China. Hong Kong is still part of China. Hong Kong is part of China. And he doesn't have the kind of engagement that I have. I teach mostly mainland students on a weekly basis. Every year I see 200 of them. And I can see even in this 6.5 years I've been in Hong Kong, that their sense of optimism, their sense of confidence in the China story has diminished. Right? So when I talk about this born again Chinese phenomenon, I say first and foremost, go talk to actual Chinese people, right? Who are who are struggling with, grappling with the slowdown. Whereas, rather than engage in this one-track, unidimensional, linear projection. Remember, I started by saying, my training in the government was partly as a scenario planner. So, I want China to succeed. I want China to be the largest economy in the world, right? That would be good to reduce global inequality. Right? So, but just because something is desirable doesn't make it more probable, and certainly doesn't make it inevitable. Right? You talk about biases, behavior economics. One very common bias is this optimism bias. Right? The optimism bias is our tendency to believe that our desired outcomes, our desired scenarios are the most probable. Right? So as a scenario planner, we always tell ourselves, because of the optimism bias, you have to force yourself to think about undesirable, right, but plausible scenarios. What if your favorite scenario doesn't materialize? How might it fail to materialize? Construct a story how your worst case outcomes might occur. Right? So that's the discipline of scenario planning. So the book is really about, I accept that it's entirely possible that China, after this current blip, this current slowdown, recovers strongly, develops cutting-edge technologies that are world-beating, and that drives China's, propels China to become not just a developed economy, but an incredibly high-tech economy. That's one plausible scenario. But there's also an equally plausible scenario that economists now refer to as Japanification, right? It refers to that 20-year period when the Japanese economy kind of stagnated, years of, debt deflation, property price declines, zombie companies. So that's also a plausible scenario. And we have to entertain those possibilities.
But that's almost counter to not just the Singaporean perspective, but now, with the talk of tariffs, right? They're like, the US is declining, China is going to take over. You see all these CNN commentators.
China has won already.
You never fight with China. China will never yield. China will win. But then, like reading your essays, I was like, wait, this is very different. Are people, even in the West, they're missing something? Or is it due to the biases like that? Or is it just politicized a little too much?
So another bias is the binary bias. Just because one side is down, the other side must be up. The opponent must be up. But tariffs are not zero-sum, right? Tariffs are lose-lose. Zero-sum means whatever the US loses, China gains, right? The one side loses, the other side gains by as much. Lose-lose means both sides lose. It is entirely possible that, the tariffs are incredibly self-destructive. It hurts American consumers. It hurts American firms that produce abroad to sell to US consumers, right? So there'll be a fall in US consumption demand. That hurts, obviously, American consumers. That hurts American firms that are producing abroad and exporting to the US. So there's no doubt that the first and foremost loser in the tariff war is the US itself, right? But that doesn't mean China is going to come out winning, right? Winning here simply means I lose less. And one reason that China may not lose less, although I think that China does lose less, but one reason it may not lose less is China is way more dependent on American demand than America is dependent on Chinese demand. How many American firms produce in China to serve American consumer needs? Many, right? Tesla, Nike, Apple. Apple still produces most of its smartphones in China. How many Chinese firms produce in the US to sell to Chinese consumers back home? Hardly any. Right? So, we might think, as part of this binary bias, we think, trade deficit, bad. Trade surplus, China, good. Right? So, therefore, if the US is doing this, it must be bad for the US. It can only be good for the US because it can only be good for China because China has such a big trade surplus. But actually, China's large and growing trade surpluses are actually, at least partially, a sign of weakness, a sign of weak domestic demand. That's why they have all this excess capacity that they need to export abroad. Right? I live in Hong Kong. I can't afford a car in Singapore any longer. But in Hong Kong, I can. Right? So I pay attention to car prices. Right, prices of BYD have come down by about 30%. Not because BYD has gotten so much more efficient, but because there's so much excess capacity of electric vehicles, right, that they're selling it at, barely above cost. So it's great for consumers, right? But if you're a producer or you're a country that's trying to compete with BYD, that sucks, right? So so that binary bias, this idea that what is good for China must be bad for the US and vice versa. What is bad for the US is good for China is also a bias. It's entirely possible. In fact, it is a well-known established economic fact that tariffs are lose-lose. It's bad for America, it's bad for China.
You talk about lose-lose, right? I think in Singapore, it's lose for Singapore. At least what is being put out there. I don't know, because of last week when Lawrence Wong, did the speech, in his office and then subsequently a ministerial statement, actually around the world, a lot of people were watching those videos and it seemed to resonate a lot. Do you feel and then there was a debate in Singapore whether it was overblown or fear-mongering. How do you feel about the tone of what he was saying?
I don't think it was overblown. I think it's important because people may not realize that Singapore will be adversely affected by these tariffs. Even if it's just 10% for us, the base rate and everybody else, and China is high. Because we export, much of our exports are, or at least some of our exports are to China,
Yeah.
right, to sell to the rest of the world. So if China is slapped with higher tariffs, that will trickle down to, trade is now conducted through all these complex value chains, global supply chains.
Yeah.
Right, so we may not export directly to China, to the US, but we may export to the US via China. And to the extent that the tariffs reduce American demand for Chinese exports, that might also hurt us, right, and our exports to China. So I don't think it was overblown. I think it's right as an initial communications message that Singapore is going to be hurt. We shouldn't be too sanguine. We shouldn't be Panglossian that we'll be fine.
Yeah.
Right. But I think we need to also think beyond that. So I did this post on Facebook about how actually we have coping mechanisms. Right. Our consumption share of GDP is unusually low. So and actually what is a better measure of people's well-being. It's not GDP per capita in the abstract. It is consumption level. So we can afford to increase domestic consumption. And of course, a big part of the reason why we have such low domestic consumption is savings. Very high savings mean very low consumption, right? And the big saver in Singapore is the Singapore government.
Yeah.
Right. The main form of savings, government savings, would be surplus accumulation. Right? And so so we can support domestic consumption as well as government consumption if the government simply say, we don't need to accumulate so much fiscal surplus. Right? This is the rainy day that you're talking about. What?
Yeah.
Right. And second, we can also find ways to help Singaporeans save less for housing. I mean, the reason Singaporeans save so much is because they fear that housing is becoming unaffordable. Right. So if we give them the assurance that or we assure them that housing will not become more unaffordable, right, that your income increases will always be faster than HDB flat price increases, then people have greater confidence to spend. We are a very trade dependent economy, right? Our net exports, trade exports less imports, is about 35% of GDP. That is unusually large. Even China, whose large trade surplus is one of the causes of this trade war, is only 5% of GDP. Right? And that, of course, the Chinese economy is much larger.
Yeah.
Right? 5% of the Chinese economy is like, close to 1% of the global economy. So our 35% is huge, nonetheless, right? And so we can afford to have a smaller trade surplus. In other words, rely less on our trade surplus to drive GDP growth, right? And rely more on domestic consumption and domestic investment. I'm not asking for big changes, just tweaks at the margin. Right? And because if you have too big a boost to domestic consumption, you might cause inflation, you might have an asset bubble, whatever, right? So as I say, right, we will always be a trade dependent economy, but we need not be so dependent on trade surpluses. Right? There's a big difference between being a trade dependent economy and a trade surplus dependent economy.
So I mean, like, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that we need to drive domestic consumption, right? But the one thing that we also always hear is
we import everything, right?
and Singapore market is too small. But what you're saying is that the Singapore market is not too small.
Yeah, we are like
underserved.
We are 30 something in terms of GDP.
Yeah.
Our total GDP, right, is about 30 something in the world. So we are a top 40 at least. In terms of the size of it. So this is by any means a middle-sized economy. Our total GDP now is 500 billion US dollars. Malaysia is below 400. Hong Kong's is just around 400.
And you're saying we're not spending enough of that on the domestic
And the reason
market.
we're not spending enough is because a relatively small part of that goes to household incomes. So our household consumption is low because relative to what we produce, household incomes are low. Right. Yeah. Of course, if you compare to Malaysia, compare to Hong Kong, household incomes are not low. But relative to our total output, right? What workers produce, wages as a share of that output are relatively. I think wage share of GDP is only about 40+%. In developed countries, about 60-70% of GDP. In developed countries, even in other trade-dependent economies, let's say like Denmark, right? Domestic consumption, which means household consumption plus government consumption, is about more than 60% of GDP. Hong Kong is also about 60% of GDP. And both Denmark and Hong Kong are very, very trade dependent.
And when you say domestic consumption, just to understand, it is for domestically produced?
No. This is what households consume domestically. That means the stuff they buy here, even if it's most of that is imports. So in that, the GDP equation, I don't know if you did A-level economics.
I didn't.
You didn't? No wonder.
I plus
Yeah. So
G.
Y national output or national income.
So must
Y.
treat me like a noob.
It's okay. Most of the people who commented on Facebook were also quite economically.
Thanks, Donald. Thanks. Bucking me with that group. But please go on.
So Y national output equals to C, right? Consumption, domestic consumption, whatever is consumed within our borders, plus I, domestic investments, plus net exports, X minus M. Right? So whatever you consume, let's say after this we go eat nasi lemak, right? That counts towards the C. But a lot of the guy's ingredients would be M, imported.
Yeah.
So the domestic consumption less the imports is what we call the domestic value added.
Okay.
That's the part that's captured in Singapore.
The thing that turns it to nasi lemak, right?
So yes, of course, whatever you consume. So one of the responses to that post was, whatever we consume will just be leaked out in the form of imports. Now that is a very dangerous line of thinking. You are thinking like Trump, right? That person is thinking like Trump. Imports bad. Imports bad. Right? And whatever we consume or whatever we increase our consumption of will also lead to an increase in imports, right? But there will be a part that increases the domestic value added, right? So the nasi lemak seller, right? His profit would increase, right? Or his revenue would increase, and with that he can hire more workers, and then those more workers can go consume, right? Other stuff. So that leads to a virtuous cycle of more consumption. So the important thing to remember is that economic growth, unlike geopolitics, is not zero sum, right? Your consumption is somebody else's income. Your consumption expenditure is somebody else's income. And with that income, he can consume more, right? And then that additional consumption might benefit you, right? Because if you produce something that other people would consume more of, you benefit. So this emphasis on this idea that a trade deficit is inherently bad is a terrible, terrible idea. That's not how the real economy works. I mean, if you want to avoid all trade deficits, right, with every single country, which is what Trump seems to be trying to do, it's like me as an individual. So, I run a permanent trade deficit with my barber, right? Every year I'm paying him hundreds of dollars, and he never buys anything from me. Yeah. Right? So from now on, I'm going to cut my own hair so that I don't run a trade deficit with my barber. Then what about food? I'm also very upset with my kopitiam, my neighborhood coffee shop, because every year I spend hundreds of dollars on them, and they never buy anything from me. I produce a book, they also don't buy my book. I also run a permanent trade deficit with my coffee shop. So for now, I'm going to cook my own food. But what about ingredients? I'm going to grow my own food. What about my clothes? Every year I spend thousands of dollars from this Uniqlo or whatever. Right? I don't like that. I don't like that trade deficit. I'm going to start growing my cotton. Putting aside whether you have enough time and skills to do everything, it is just incredibly inefficient. Right? It's going to be incredibly costly for you. All right, even if you can, know how to grow your own food and grow cotton and cut your own hair, right? It is just dumb as hell, right? So what do? We trade, right, at the individual level. And then you extend this to the firm level. Firms trade, and then you extend it to the country level. Countries trade, right? With some countries you run a trade deficit. With other countries you run a trade surplus, right? As long as your overall trade balance is fine, and even if you are running an overall trade deficit, as long as that can be financed sustainably. And how do you finance that? You can finance that with investments from abroad. Other people buy your assets so that you sell your assets, you earn income too. Right? So the US, yes, runs a large overall trade deficit, right? Of which the trade deficit of China is about slightly over 20%. Right? But the US runs a very large capital account surplus. In other words, it attracts lots of foreign capital. That's what allows the US to afford to consume much more than it sells to the rest of the world, to buy a lot more imports than it exports to the world. So that's a sign of the American strength. That's a sign of strength of the American economy, that it can consume well above what it produces, right? Because foreigners are willing to lend it money. Why are foreigners willing to lend it money? Because they have confidence in your ability to pay back. Likewise, China's trade deficit is a sign of weakness, at least partially a sign of trade surplus. Right? China's trade surplus is at least partially a sign of weakness. There's not enough domestic demand. They're producing far too much. That's contributing to deflation pressures, prices falling. That's contributing to excess supply.
Yeah.
And how do they get rid of this excess supply? They sell it cheaply in other countries. So that's a sign of weakness, right? Rather than a sign of strength.
So where Singapore stands, I mean, we have a budget surplus.
Yes.
Right.
We have a surplus everywhere.
Yeah. So
budget surplus, trade surplus.
Yeah. So are you saying that, as much as you say, let's say, keeping housing costs low, and whenever I hear those things being pitched in Parliament, the one question is, how are you going to fund it? So are you kind of saying that
we can easily fund all these things, lor?
By reducing the surpluses?
Yeah.
But what about the rainy day or not?
Well, we can talk about rainy day when the government tells us how much they have already squared away for the rainy day.
Right. So for you are for more transparency of the reserves.
Yeah, I've written about that. Yeah. So I mean, I used to be in Ministry of Finance, so I actually know what are the size of our reserves, at least in those days.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you, otherwise I'll have to shoot you.
Yeah.
but we are not at risk of, killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. We are surplus and surplus upon surplus. On a per capita basis, right, the reserves per person in Singapore are among the highest in the world. Right? Comparable to Qatar or Norway or whatever.
But then what about the other thing that we always hear is that, we are a small country. If people know our reserves, it becomes a potential weakness that they can target. We need to...
But people do know we have a lot already. Right?
Yeah.
Who is under the illusion that Singapore is very little?
Yeah.
And therefore, Singapore doesn't have much, so let's not target Singapore. Everybody knows we have a lot already. Right?
So you think generally our policies are still a little too conservative?
Yeah, too tight-fisted. I mean, we are running policy of fiscal accumulation, right? Surplus accumulation. At a time when the population is aging, right? And we should be thinking of how we can, even if we don't decumulate, we don't have to accumulate so aggressively.
Yeah.
So you never message your ex-colleague once in a while?
No, better not.
No, but
Lawrence knows where I stand on all these issues.
Yeah.
But I mean, but I've also read people saying like, you all want to dip into reserves, but you think about rainy day situation, like how we got the first vaccines in the world, right? Like a small country like Singapore is because of this size of these reserves and all that. So
no, fair enough. You can come up with countless benefits, right? Of scenarios, war, right? A natural catastrophe, a pandemic that will call on use of these reserves.
Yeah.
But that is not policy, right? What is policy? What policy should be? What is the optimal? Right? As economists, we always think in terms of optimality. It's never the case for any economics question. It's seldom the case that the more is better. Right? There's always an idea of trade-off, right? So when you accumulate so fast, so much and so aggressively, what are you giving up? Right? What you're giving up is current consumption, right? Some current needs are not met.
Yeah.
So it cannot be the case that, all extreme, whatever the extreme scenario, that justifies relentless surplus accumulation. So in other words, I don't fundamentally disagree with the merits of having strong reserves position. The question is, how much is enough? Right? That's a very typical economist question, right? How much? Right? There's always a point at which the additional returns start to diminish.
Yeah.
So I think we've reached that point. The returns from additional reserves accumulation is already diminishing. Maybe already zero. I don't know, right? Since we can't have reserves transparency, that question cannot be resolved. And also, there's also some element of inherent uncertainty, right? So let's say at the individual level, right? I say, you might live till 150,
Yeah.
We might discover some miracle drug that allows you to live till 150. And therefore, you should save not just for, triple your current retirement savings or double your retirement savings. Then what do you give up? You give up current consumption. Is that optimal? Probably not. Is there a chance that you will live till 150? Yes, but it's a very small chance.
Yeah.
Right? And should you plan on the basis of that? Probably not. Right?
So then do you think there are parallels in what you pointed out in this book where, you said that it reached a point of COVID-0 where it was so entrenched that they can't turn around. Do you think the surplus thing in Singapore is reaching a point? Because I would imagine if any finance minister or any prime minister comes out and says, we are going to use the reserves, it will be a shock to a lot of
But we did use the reserves on COVID, global financial crisis.
But in a non-pandemic kind of situation.
No, we're not asking, we don't need to use the reserves under ordinary circumstances.
Yeah.
Even with this tariff war, I don't think we will need to call on
Or maybe even reduce the
accumulation. So in other words, every year the budget surpluses, and I'm not just talking about the budget surpluses that are reported every year in the budget. There are also hidden surpluses, right? What we call current reserves, where when government sells land, that goes straight to reserves.
Yeah.
That doesn't show up as a budget surplus. It just goes straight to reserve accumulation. So in other words, the reserves almost independently of what the government, almost independently of what the government in office, what budget surpluses it runs, the reserves, right, the stock, right, every year the budget surpluses are a flow. But then there's a stock, a giant stock. Right? Think of it as our armory, right? That independently is growing. Right, because we invest it well, blah blah blah. Okay, maybe this year will be rough, thanks to bloody Trump, right? But in normal times, that grows at about 4 or 5% a year. So even if we don't accumulate, even if we don't run any more budget surpluses, right, because of the way we treat revenues from land sale, go straight to that pool of that stock, that armory. So it's hard to have a discussion on these macro issues. When A, there's so little info out there. B, economic literacy is not particularly high. So I find it damn funny. The people who are very upset about Trump, their responses, their solutions are also very Trumpist. We should minimize export. We should minimize imports. We try to export more. That is exactly the Trump. You sound like Trump.
Yeah, very protectionist.
Very mercantilist. Right? Mercantilism is this idea that we should only export and try to minimize imports. But if every country pursues that, then who's going to be buying your stuff? Right? Mercantilism is zero sum. Right? We all lose if all of us were to pursue mercantilist policies.
I mean, in some way, when you're saying it, I almost think of going to friends' weddings. Beyond a certain point, you're like, every time I go, I have to export my money and they import my
you'll always be going for more weddings than people come to yours, right?
Then I'm like, after a point, I'm like, screw this. I'm not going to go for any weddings. But then I lose friends.
Exactly.
So then you can have a trade, ang pao surplus, but I got a friend deficit lah. Or if I have a ang pao deficit.
And running an ang pao deficit is fine as long as your other sources of income more than make up for the deficit, right? Nobody is so you are obsessed only about trying to minimize my ang pao deficit or maximize my ang pao surplus. I mean, that is a dumb way to do financial planning, right?
Except for the weddings where they impose
a minimum. A minimum
ang pao.
Has it become like that?
Got sometimes like that, like sometimes like that. Then that one I boycott.
I just want to ask also, because you talk about the presence of the state, right, in Singapore. But there are certain sectors that, when we talk to people, for example, when we talk to a lot of opposition politicians, they always talk about education reform in Singapore. Like, especially, let's say, the tuition industry in Singapore is just rampant, like it's crazy, really. Then I look at the other extreme, like in China, where, big crackdown and
they killed it.
Killed it, right? But also had a lot of effects as well.
Unintended consequences.
And then in Singapore's side, when you prod the education minister or something, and they want to have a laissez-faire approach to it, are there instances that you think Singapore should have a bigger presence in, say, policing sectors like tuition
private
industry
education
and things like that we are not, we should maybe even look at China as an example?
No need, no need to resort to such, market unfriendly, heavy-handed interventions. If you really wanted people to, there's a legitimate concern that there's too much arms race in education, right? You get tuition, then other people will get more tuition, and you are forced to take more tuition. And then overall, we are all spending more money, and our relative position remains unchanged. Right. So I've written about this in a previous book called Hard Choices, about how this sort of arms races is, doesn't increase the pie, right? You're just maintaining your relative position. So if we really wanted to reduce spending in private education, there are smarter ways of doing it. For instance, you require schools, right? You engage more teachers, engage more teaching assistants, whatever, right? To run after-school programs. It can be for weak students, it can be for everyone. Make all our schools full-day schools, right? A more extreme solution, which friend of mine who used to be at Ministry of Education, obviously I won't name him because he'll be very unpopular, is reduce holiday time. Right? Because it is during holidays where the better off kids will do more stuff, right? Go on enrichment classes, go on
Reduce holiday time.
right? So, holidays are the part where the unequal family resources really show up, right? So if you really are concerned about educational disparities caused by private education, you don't have to ban it. You simply have to reduce the amount of time that people can spend on that by increasing, filling the people's students' times meaningfully with school activities, with ECAs, CCAs now as they're called, with enrichment classes, whatever. Right?
So there are levers that can still be pulled before we have to go to that.
Yeah, in general, economists, we are very averse to bans of any sort. Whether it's bans on private education, bans on e-cigarettes.
Right? But Singapore is very good at
we are very good at banning.
Like
of course.
PMDs overnight, they just disappeared.
But there are unintended consequences also, right? I mean, has e-cigarettes, have they disappeared?
No.
Right?
Black market.
There's a black market.
And is it because like they believe that the free market will kind of sort things out? Or what's the philosophy behind being against bans?
What's the philosophy against being? Well, because when you ban something, there'll be people for whom this might be helpful, for whom this increases their utility, right? That now cannot have access to it. And then you also produce unintended consequences, black markets. I mean, the US did something called prohibition in the 1920s, right? They're very moralistic politicians. They wanted to ban all alcohol consumption. And that gave rise to bootlegging, right? Which is people producing alcohol. And it's turned out to be a lot of this alcohol that's illegally produced is unsafe. And it created a lot more public health problems. So, and the smuggling and all that increased law enforcement costs. Right, because you don't just have a ban for the sake of it, you also have to enforce the ban, right? And so it created all sorts of costs that finally they realized that the costs of that ban are much higher than whatever benefits it achieved. So they abandoned. But this prohibitionist streak is still very alive, right? In parts of America, certainly in Singapore, from time to time, 99% of the time we are very economically literate. But sometimes, that moralistic, right, that moralizing side shows up. And it, then it overwhelms our economic logic.
But I mean, say something like tray returns in hawker centers. Like in Singapore, it was horrible. Like one time, be birds feasting.
And now we just say, it's just So that one is not because people are afraid of being caught, right? It's when they change the rule, right? Previously, we encouraged it. Now you have to do it. The reason it worked is it changed norms. So people are doing it not because they're afraid that there's some inspector, right, that's going to catch them. The people do it because this is what you're expected to do.
But it came with the fine, right?
It came with the fine, right? Isn't it? Like,
so what the fine did was to signal to people that this is what society expects you to do. I don't think people, what do you guys do? You return your tray because you're afraid of the fine? Or because now you think this is what is normal, this is a socially normal behavior.
I mean, we were returning trays before that.
Right, okay.
We are exemplary.
Me too.
We're very good citizens. But I'll admit, I was very pleasantly surprised that
Singapore
very quickly
if people were just worried about fines, then you see them looking around before doing their trades. But people it just created a norm. It just created
how would you look at it from an economic lens? Because what you said is behavioral. Is bad. So behavioral change. So it's like a spank is once in a while good.
This is like a nudge. Okay, a fine is not a nudge. A fine is a penalty. It's like a disincentive. But it's a nudge in the sense that it changed norms. It signaled to people. Right? Previously, people. Besides the fact that why do people not return their trays previously? Maybe because they found it troublesome. It was inconvenient, or maybe they think that you look like an idiot, right?
If you return, then the
people look at you fine. All this stuff. Now the social signal that the government gave is you are expected. This is normal behavior, right? In fact, if you don't return your tray, it is considered abnormal. Right. And so abnormal that we will fine you. Right. And it's not as if NEA sends out inspectors to go and catch people
They
right?
did at some point.
Yeah,
That's
early
like-
on, but then they realize it's not necessary because compliance is so high.
Yeah.
So
Right? So
then
that's the best kind of compliance, right? That you don't have to enforce because society is self-enforcing.
So then would you prefer if like there was a $10,000 fine on e-cigarettes compared to a ban?
Oh yeah, just regulate it, lah. Tax
just
it, lah.
regulate
Just
it,
tax it, lah. Don't ban it, tax it.
Mm.
And you think it's you think it's more dangerous than cigarettes, then tax it more than cigarettes, lah. Even the cigarettes which are so harmful, do you guys smoke? No, right?
No.
Even cigarettes which are so harmful, we allow it. We don't ban it,
but we tax it.
and we tax it heavily,
Yeah.
right? So if you think e-cigarettes are as bad, then tax is the same as cigarettes are. Why give away a potentially valuable source of revenue? You say we're short of revenue, then go and tax e-cigarettes instead of ban. When you ban something, you cannot tax it,
Yeah.
right? How can you tax something that's illegal? Right? You can't tax cannabis if you ban it, right?
Yeah.
Not that I'm saying we should leave.
That's going to be a clip that people are going to take. And sorry, Donald, you just dug a hole for yourself.
That's the clip.
No, so I mean, looking at all that, I mean, you know, the elections are coming up, like, and I'm sure you have a vested interest in how the elections go in Singapore.
You sound like I have financial interest like that.
Invested.
Or maybe
I'm
a
not taking any
soulful,
bets.
soulful interest.
Soulful
Interest. Like what would be your advice for Singaporeans in terms of how to think about the elections? Because there's short term, there's short term gain. There's people saying very populist things. There's people just
No lah.
using
By
these
the
buzzwords.
standards of the world, the kind of populism here is
harmless.
harmless. Oh, okay, I'm not entirely harmless. Mostly harmless.
Yeah.
There's no real xenophobia. There's no real extreme populism. And then, so so it's a very difficult question to answer because, as I said, I'm friends with Lauren.
Yeah.
I would like him to succeed, right? As the incumbent prime minister, if Lawrence does well, Singapore does well, and Singaporeans do well, right? But at the same time, I have lots of friends in the opposition, and I also want them to do well because I think they genuinely bring something to the table that the PAP doesn't, right? They bring alternatives, they bring ideas, they bring potential solutions that we've talked about reserves, right? They potentially have a lot to offer, and I want them to do well also. So I guess partly look at who's contesting in your ward, right? If you think that the opposition candidates there are credible, can bring something to parliament. Don't forget, with general elections, we are not primarily voting for town councillors, which is what to a large extent, the PAP has framed elections as. You're voting, if you don't vote for PAP, your quality of town maintenance would decline, blah, blah, blah. But that's not what Parliament is for. It's to debate and make decisions and to pass laws on national issues, right? So when you vote for your MP, that's essentially what you're voting for. It is the PAP that created this creature called town councils after 1988.
Yeah.
So as to, make people think that, if you get somebody who's not from the PAP, he may not be able to manage your town so well. But primarily, elections are about electing someone to represent you
in Parliament.
So
it's
on
not
national
so much,
issues.
Not so much the local impact of where you live, but
we have with elections, we have the PAP have conflated municipal issues, right? Cleaning, rubbish disposal, lift maintenance, upgrading projects, lift upgrading with national issues. Right? And that's not good. That's not good, right? In other jurisdictions, in most other jurisdictions, municipal should have municipal elections, mayoral elections, right? And then MPs are to debate, right? And to policies, national policies.
I mean, there is quite a pervasive, almost like a reverence for the MP.
Yeah, it shouldn't be
here,
like that,
which I always found it strange, especially coming from overseas and all.
Right.
Do people talk with that kind of reverence in Hong Kong about politicians and all?
Do they stand up when they enter the room and clap?
Yeah.
No,
They're almost disdainful.
they will sit down.
And I thought that was the norm around the world. Then I came to Singapore, I was like, wow, like people's wedding also have to stand up.
No, I think the PAP itself doesn't like that also.
Oh, okay.
They also feel that there's too much unnecessary reverence.
Oh, when you say that, like PAP itself doesn't like that, you mean like
the new guard, the old guard? No comment?
Guard.
I don't know lah.
Another whole Donald.
No lah. Last time, when I worked with ministers and all, they also say it's not healthy. Right? We should be much more of an egalitarian. We shouldn't put politicians on a pedestal and all that. Even if they're elected. Right?
Yeah. Right.
But I mean, like I think like you framing it that way, that it's not about your local municipal, but it is about the voting people into a parliament. It's a good thought lah. It's a good thought.
Yeah,
Good
and that's the mainstream view everywhere else in the world.
Yeah, but
It's only in Singapore that we have conflated.
Yeah,
Right, and in fact, we not just conflated. We created a new role for MPs
Yeah.
as town councillors.
Yeah.
And then over time, that new role became
superseding.
superseding the real role of MPs.
Ah,
Right, so that is unhealthy lah.
yeah.
Right? Even if you think it's good that local MPs have some municipal responsibility, that should not be the main function. What?
Yeah.
If that's the main function, then have local elections, municipal
Yeah.
elections.
I mean, that's a nice thought, like a one takeaway, I think, for people thinking about the elections, which is great lah. Because these next few weeks are going to be super exciting.
Yeah.
So I mean, thank you so much for taking the time. The book is available where? At the price of zero.
The price of zero. The price of zero is not zero. It's retailing at $26. Very affordable, cheap.
Yeah.
You can get it at Kinokuniya.
Yeah.
You can get it at some of these independent bookstores, like Book Bar, which is on Duxton Road, on Grassroots. Bookstore in Bukit Pasoh. At City Book Room, which is in Joo Chiat Road.
Yeah.
Or you can just buy it directly from my website, which is thepriceofzero.org.
.org. Okay.
Cool. And if people wanted to find out
It's
more
also
about-
available on Epigram, so you can
Epigram,
order it from Epigram.
Okay.
Okay. And if people wanted to find out more about you, like follow you for your writings, is it Facebook, LinkedIn? You have your own personal
Facebook,
website?
LinkedIn, buy my
Instagram.
book. Yeah.
Instagram or TikTok?
Instagram is just my food and travel pictures.
Food and travel pictures.
And then the dancing is on TikTok lah. The dancing and all.
I don't have TikTok. In Hong Kong they don't have TikTok.
Oh, is it?
Oh, then it's what Douyin or something.
Douyin.
Yeah.
So I can't follow the TikTok videos from Singapore.
Man,
I'm
you're
missing out.
Missing out, man.
All the guitar playing from your ex-colleague.
But that one, I think they will post on Instagram also.
Then now even opposition plays saxophone and everything. So much.
No,
so
and I think
interesting.
like when people search you on Instagram, if you see running photos and food photos, it's the correct Donald Low.
Yeah,
Because I think, they hear economist, professor, and then you go there like, hey, running and food. Nothing about economy.
Hey, food and economics are very very
But your
integrated.
food
They're
posts don't-
economists now who write books on food.
Yeah. But your food post is just about the food lah.
Oh, that's very insulting.
Oh,
The
I haven't
caption,
seen,
read the caption.
I haven't seen the
No,
captions.
you're right.
It's just about food. Yeah, I've seen. I'm like, hey, Donald, I'm looking for the post that you've made. Food,
Supply chain issues, everything.
Okay.
That is true. You can indeed talk about supply chain issues. In Japan, which I go a lot.
Yeah.
Right. I write about. Sometimes I say, hey, how come Japan has not had food price inflation?
Yeah.
How come prices have barely moved in
Yeah.
the last 15 years?
Yeah.
In fact, by some measures, they have fallen for tourists
Yeah,
because
for
of
Singapore,
depreciation, right? So you can certainly turn it into a very substantive economics post.
Okay, I take that back.
Kidding lah. I'm not bothered anyway. Not that I actually bother doing this.
Cool. Then we just have the one final question for you, which is, the one final segment, like the one Shiok Thing segment.
Yeah.
So the brief is something that you have read or watched or something that you can share with our audience through a link. So we can go first. And Terence, you have your one Shiok Thing.
My own Shiok Thing is, it's a fantastic step for women and science and everything. But at the same time, the responses to it are quite funny. I'm not sure if you all follow, but recently there was an all-female space crew that went on a Blue Sky,
Atlantic. Blue Origin,
the Jeff Bezos space company.
Yeah.
He cobbled together an all-female space crew consisting of luminaries like Katy Perry and CNN.
Wait, this actually already happened.
Happened already.
They landed.
Yeah, I heard the screams when they landed.
It went up and
screams,
came down already. So there's a whole video, a 23-minute video on CNN of the launch, and then the whole thing coming down, and then Jeff Bezos welcoming the women, and the first person that stepped out is his current partner, and subsequently after that was Katy Perry.
Amazing.
And then they interviewed Katy Perry, and she talked about why she brought a daisy with her up the plane, because a daisy is the only flower that can grow through concrete and cement. And they asked her what was she singing as the rocket was going up. So people were just watching, and the comments are like, wait, we're facing like tariffs crisis in the world, all that, and why are we doing this? Why is this important? But at the same time, I mean, these are, women, all female space crew going to space for the first time and having a very profound experience. So I part of me, the science geek, enjoyed watching it, but at the same time, the comments after that were
The
hilarious.
chauvinist in you came out.
No, not a chauvinist, just I was just questioning, why are we watching this again? Yeah.
No, because I think there is some controversy also, because now whether or not they're going to be labeled astronauts. I think I think some people are saying, and I think Katy Perry said herself that she's going to put the S in astronaut. So
what?
if you
The
are
S. The S.
the S in
Oh
astronaut.
my
So if you're an
God.
astronaut training for life to be an astronaut, and then you see these like your contemporaries, like, so I think there's that debate lah. There's that
You
debate.
hear the joke about Malaysia when they wanted to send somebody to space.
No.
And the Malaysians asked, what are we going to call it? The US has astronauts, the Russians have cosmonauts, the Chinese have taikonauts. What shall we call the Malaysian version, right? Then somebody said, can or not?
But I thought Malaysia has a NASA
Space program, yeah.
astronaut or
They
something,
do
right?
have,
Right?
yeah.
Something
So
like that.
he's a canonaut lah. He or she is a canonaut lah.
Boleh. Can.
Cool,
Yes.
cool. My one Shiok Thing is this YouTube channel that I came across recently, which I think is just one content creator behind it. I think it's a brilliant concept. So the channel is called It's Stefano, and the video is essentially titled like Coffee Break in Singapore. So what this person does is like they'll show themselves just sitting in their room, and then going to pick up a cup of coffee, and then walking outside their house, going to the airport, taking a plane, and it's all recorded themselves. And then it makes it seem like within a span of like 15 minutes, they're in Singapore, then they drink their coffee, and then they just go back to their seat lah. And it's like, I went to France because I'm bored, then I went home. And it's the same thing. And I just think in terms of YouTube channels right now, sometimes you see these new channels that are so overly produced.
Yeah.
It's kind of missing the beauty of YouTube back
Simplicity,
then,
yeah.
where it was just one person making these very odd videos.
Almost amateurish.
Yeah. And wow, I see this channel. I'm like, it's so nice to come across this channel, every once in a while, because it feels like, wow, this is the good old days of YouTube.
And it's very authentic, right?
Yeah, like it's
not-
grainy video.
Yeah.
It's just a funny concept. And this person has 1.48 million subscribers. So it's pretty nice to chance upon.
I'm sure it's like scripted to the max, and like they shot it in
perhaps.
4K, and then they downgrade.
Manufactured
manufactured.
authenticity.
Yeah, no, that's just because I shared on his one Shiok Thing, so he has to shit on my one
so,
Shiok Thing.
yeah.
That's a normal dynamic. That's a normal dynamic.
I'm not sharing it. Shit on
No,
mine.
you are the
No
guest.
judgment. Yeah,
You are the
yes,
guest.
you're
You are
allowed to,
afforded
yeah.
some luxuries.
Right.
So, Donald, what's your one Shiok Thing?
So many. I mean, I have so much time in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Almost everything I do is Shiok.
Yeah.
So one Shiok thing about Hong Kong is I'm very close to Japan.
Yeah.
So before I came back to Singapore, I went to Japan. It was cherry blossoms in Tokyo. It was so beautiful. And that when I landed, that was Liberation Day, right?
April
Tariffs.
2nd.
So like, wow, then the next few days, market volatility. But nothing could spoil my mood because you're surrounded by just such beauty, right?
Is there any kind of like compilation of pictures that you have taken?
Yeah, my Instagram.
So your one Shiok Thing is your Instagram.
My own Instagram.
Sakura.
Okay, but it's for something that people want to
consume.
Well, on that trip, I was reading this book called The Rise and Fall of East, and East by Huang Yasheng at MIT. And E stands for Exams, Autocracy, Stability, Technology. About the Chinese, it's very dense, but it's very well written, very deep, very solidly researched. So for nerds, please go and read that book. The book is called Rise and Fall of East. And,
East, like
EAST, the East.
EAST.
Exams, Autocracy, Stability, Technology.
Okay.
Then coming back, I rewatched this Hong Kong movie. Remember I was saying about how Hong Kongers are very gritty, very resilient. And I can the best movie that captures that Hong Kong spirit, that Lion Rock spirit, is this movie. I don't know if you guys have watched it, called Last Dance.
Michael Jordan.
No, not the Michael Jordan
not
one.
the Last Dance.
The Michael Hui one, the Hong Kong comedian.
Sorry,
So he
okay.
plays this Taoist priest that performs these Taoist rituals for people who are dead. The English translation is horrible. It shouldn't have been called Last Dance. It should have been called Brick Hell's Gate, because that's the literal translation of the Chinese name, the name's movie's Chinese name, like Paul Taeyok. So, and it's beautifully shot. It's wonderful. It shows this is set in post-COVID Hong Kong where people have lost their jobs. So this guy, he's lost his job in the wedding business. He goes as a wedding planner. He goes to become a funeral director, right? Run a funeral parlor, and he works with this Taoist priest. And then there are many layers to it, right? The Michael Hui's character, the Taoist priest, has very difficult relations with his son, whom he wants to take on the Taoist priest business, and his daughter, who obviously struggles with being treated equally, right? So it's beautifully shot. And it really it's a very Hong Kong movie, right? How they just, very gritty people. Yeah, it's best advertisement for Hong Kong tourism, I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah, go and watch it if you have not already watched it.
Last Dance.
Last Dance. The English name is Last Dance, but it's beautifully shot, and the texture, the meanings, the kind of social, cultural conflict, intergenerational conflict issues, modern versus tradition, everything comes together in this gripping, very likable movie. Yeah.
Wow, awesome.
Well, that's
two Shiok Things.
a great shout out for Hong Kong cinema. lah.
Yes. You thought it's dead already, right? And then suddenly they produce something like that and you say, hey, there's still life in this.
Wow.
Plus in Parliament recently, the Cantonese statement.
Oh, that's horrible, right?
also shout out to Hong Kong cinema also.
That's true. That's true. It's a shout out to Hong Kong cinema. But thanks so much, Donald, for joining us.
So
Thank
fun.
you.
And I mean, next time you're back, we'd love to have you back on again.
After I study my Econs 101 one more time, then we can.
So you're telling me the formula is not like, oh shit. But thanks a lot. And to everyone listening, please check out all the links in the show notes. And thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you all soon.